Good day. Over the last couple of hours, there's been the first trickle of admissions and reports in the Western media about the crisis situation that the Ukrainian forces in Soledar and Bakhmut are finding themselves in following the Russian breakthrough in Soledar. Now, to get an idea of the exact state of the battle, I'm going to reproduce a account of the situation provided, I believe, by Slavyangrad. That's where I found it, and I believe it's being collated by Slavyangrad themselves. This is a pro-Russian Telegram channel. I believe it's actually based in Canada. If that is wrong, please forgive me. But anyway, it's definitely a strongly pro-Russian Telegram channel. You have to, as I said, allow for its biases. But overall, I have found it to be a most reliable source about events on the battlefields. And I should say that, just to repeat again, that it is often strongly critical of President Putin and of his government, and of certain decisions that the Russian military have taken over the course of this war. So it is pro-Russian, but not uncritical of the Russian authorities, far from it. And as I said, overall, I found it perhaps the single most reliable source about what is happening on the battlefields at any one particular time. I say source, though, as I understand it, Slavyangrad, to a great extent, bases its reports on the basis of reports which it in turn collates and obtains from other sources, but it does seem to have a real skill in assessing the quality of its particular sources, and it seems to go with sources that are themselves reliable. Anyway, with all that, and having explained why I'm turning to Slavyangrad, I'm going to now provide their account of the situation in and around Bakhmut as of 5 minutes past midnight Moscow time on the 8th of January. And this is what it says. To the south of Bakhmut, fighting is taking place near Klesheyevka, where the Wagner group are pounding and storming Ukrainian strongholds. Klesheyevka itself has not yet been entered. To the south, that's presumably to the south of Klesheyevka, our troops are trying to advance from the Kurdyumovka on and Ozeryanivka areas, but no results are known yet. When they say our troops, of course, they mean Russian troops. And then it goes on to say, in Bakhmut itself, there is fighting in the southeastern outskirts, where Wagner operatives are fighting for every house. Part of Opitnoye has been taken. Fighting is taking place in the center of the village, and no one is marking a clear front line there now. In the vicinity of Bakhmut's industrial area, fighting is taking place in the area of the plaster factory, which is in the southeast area of Bakhmut, as I understand it, and along Patrice Lumumba Street. There is little progress, and the fighting is mostly positional in nature. And then we get to the more immediately interesting areas. The town of Podgorodnoye is taken, where the system of the Ukrainian armed forces is similar to that in Opitnoye. But they are still in the process of breaking there. In other words, in Opitnoye, they are still resisting, but their resistance is crumbling, whereas in Podgorodnoye, they have collapsed and the Russians have captured Podgorodnoye. And then it goes on to say, this is against Slavyangrad, enemy strongholds, when they say enemy, of course they mean the Ukrainians, between Podgorodnoye and Krasnaya Gora are being stormed. Ours that's to say, the Russians have not entered Krasnaya Gora yet. And then it goes on to say, in Soledar, fighting continues in the residential areas in the central part of the city. Wagner assault units have reached the salt mine 1.3, taking it. The enemy have marked themselves off GP Artem Sol. I'm not quite sure what that refers to. They're sitting on the Sol station on the western outskirts of Soledar, having transferred the 46th Brigade from the Zaporozhye direction to reinforce it. Russian troops have entered the town, that's to say Soledar, from the Yakovlevka side, and there are reports of advances westwards to the Seversk-Soledar highway, but even here the front line is difficult to mark at the moment. Now I'm going to, as I said, discuss some of this in a short time. And then the Slavyangrad goes on to refer to Boris Rozhin. This is another Russian commentator I've spoken about in the past, whom I've tended to find, again, reliable. He is not, again, affiliated to President Putin's government. He's often very critical of it. And as I said, I believe he's based in Crimea. But, put that aside. I may be wrong about that. What I do know is that he writes under the pen name Colonel Kassad, but we all know who he is. According to military expert Boris Rozhin, the capture of Soledar will allow the Russians to cover enemy positions in Bakhmut from the north. At the same time, problems will arise for the Ukrainian defense north of Soledar at the line of Veseloye, Belogorovka, Berestovoye, and Spornoye. Cutting the Seversk-Soledar route will enable an offensive along it to Seversk. If the offensive towards Seversk and northwards develops, the enemy, that's to say the Ukrainians, will be deprived of the opportunity to use a bridgehead near the second Belogorovka. That's lots of different Belogorovkas in this part of the world. Near the Seversky Donetsk River, from where the Ukrainians have been trying to put pressure on Lysychansk, and through the forested area to Kremenaya. So this is going to have a complex impact. And the Ukrainians are trying to cling on to an area of weapons depots, the Artem Sol, underground communications and urban development. I presume this is Artyom, presumably Artyom Sol, presumably refers to Bakhmut, and Sol relates to Soledar. So I'm assuming that there's some kind of communications or industrial facility located between Soledar and Bakhmut to which this relates to, but I'm not going to pretend that I know what Artyom Sol actually is. But anyway, I'll decipher this report in a moment. And then the article goes on to say, retreating to Bakhmut. At this point, the report, by the way, switches from referring to the city we've been talking about as Bakhmut. They refer to it now as Artyomovsk, which is, of course, the Russian name for the place, but I'm going to stick with Bakhmut. Retreating to Bakhmut, the enemy will attempt, the Ukrainians in other words, will attempt to hold the defenses in the western part of the city, if necessary, by withdrawing to prepared positions near Chasov Yar, using the dominant heights, before retreating to Druzhkovo, Kramatorsk, and Konstantinovka. So that will be the next line of defense, a line Kramatorsk, Konstantinovka, Druzhovka. We'll discuss that in a moment. With the Ukrainians pushing through at Bakhmut, the front is hardly likely to crumble. And then it finishes: a defensive breakthrough at Soledar could have more serious consequences for the Ukrainians than the loss of Bakhmut itself. That's what it means. But everything depends on the pace of the Russian advance and how quickly the Ukrainians are able to stabilize the line after losing Soledar. The position of the Ukrainians in this direction is close to critical, which is confirmed by the redeployment of formations from the Zaporozhye direction, the Zaporozhye front, to Bakhmut and Soledar. If their front line is shattered, it will not only be shattered there. So that's an account of where things were as of the first few minutes of today, according to Moscow time. And let's just unpack what this means. So we're told that fighting is going on near Kleshcheyevka, but it seems that the Russians have not entered this village yet. Now, Kleshcheyevka is a village between Opytnoye, which is an important village that sits astride the road into Bakhmut from the south, and another village which is to the west of Kleshcheyevka, which is Ivanovka. Ivanovka sits astride a road which enters Bakhmut from the west. And we can see that the Russians are gradually pushing the Ukrainians out of Opytnoye. The fighting is taking place in the center of Opytnoye. There's no clear front line, but it's clear that the Russians have the initiative. They're also pushing, they're also advancing, they're also trying to capture Kleshcheyevka, relatively small place, but there's clearly intense fighting going on there. And other reports, earlier reports that I've read, suggest that advanced parties of the Russian forces have already been approaching and launching strikes on Ivanovka as well, which, as I said, is to the west of Kleshcheyevka. So there's an awful lot of fighting going on in this part of the battle, which you could describe as the southwest suburbs of Bakhmut. And we also read that there are advances from the Russians are advancing from Kurdyumovka and Ozeryanivka. These are two other villages, which, by the way, about 2 weeks ago, the Ukrainians claim to have recaptured. Well, clearly they haven't. But anyway, fighting is going on at an intense level there. And the Russians are continuing to advance into Bakhmut from the industrial sector in the south, along Patrice Lumumba Street. They've captured another factory complex. These factory complexes are important. They've been used by Ukraine as important fortifications, fortified areas, and they've captured another factory, a plaster factory, and they're continuing to advance, or at least try to advance, along Patrice Lumumba Street into the center of Bakhmut from the southeast. But in this area, the fighting is slow. But then we come to the really dramatic changes, because as I reported about 2 days ago, the Russians captured a suburb, or an area of what is essentially a part of the Soledar urban area, which is itself, in my opinion, a suburb, a kind of extended suburb of Bakhmut itself. The Russians captured an urban area called Bakhmutsky, and they've now captured another area to the south of Bakhmutsky called Podgorodnoye. Now, Podgorodnoye is located between Bakhmutsky and Soledar to the north, and Bakhmut itself to the south. So it's midway between these two places. And the Russians now control it. And the importance of that is not just that it has brought the Russians into a position where they're able to advance on Bakhmut itself from the north, which apparently they're starting to do, but it's also bringing the Russians close to capturing, or at least advancing upon, another village, Krasnaya Gora. Now, Krasnaya Gora sits astride another road that leads to Bakhmut from the north. And what we learn over the course of this report, this is Boris Rozhin's analysis, that it's referred to Krasnaya Gora, the road that passes through Krasnaya Gora apparently leads to Siversk, which is the northern limb, the town at the end of the northern limb of the current Ukrainian defense line, the so-called Zelensky line, as I've seen it sometimes called. And if Krasnaya Gora falls, if the Russians are able to capture Krasnaya Gora, which they look likely to do fairly soon, then it won't just be the case that Bakhmut will be in effective encirclement, not just encirclement, but Ukrainian troops inside it will lose another exit corridor, but it will open the road for the Russians to advance north towards Siversk, which is of course also being attacked by other Russian forces from the east. And at that point, the entire defense line in the north, Ukrainian defense line in the north, in and around Siversk, will start to become undefendable. And Boris Rozhin seems to, well, I'm not going to say that he agrees with me, but of course he doesn't agree, but he has reached a similar conclusion to the one that I did. I'd reached in an earlier program. I said that if Siversk were to come under Russian control, Ukrainian positions in northern Donbass would, so it seems to me, start to crumble. And that's what Boris Rozhin seems to be saying. He says that if the Ukrainians lose Soledar and lose Krasnaya Gora, and the Russians are able to advance up the road from the south towards Siversk, attacking Siversk, in other words, from two directions, then the entire Ukrainian position in northern Donbass and southern Kharkiv region, the areas around Krasny Liman, not mentioned in this report, by the way, but that it's generally located in this area, and places like the two Belogorovkas and Spornoye and all of those places, the Ukrainian positions there will fall under intense pressure, and indeed might even start to collapse. At which point, the entire thrust of the current Ukrainian effort to launch offensives towards Kremenaya and Svatovo will also collapse, and ensuring the successful defense of northern Lugansk region. Now, as I said, we hear, however, that the Ukrainians are trying to cling on to the western suburbs of Soledar. They've apparently dug in at this place called Artyom Sol, which I'm not quite sure what it is, as I said previously. They're also trying to position themselves on another location called the Sol station, which presumably is also some kind of a facility in the west of Soledar. And the Ukrainians are also trying to set up a defense line in case Bakhmut falls to the west of Bakhmut itself. That would be along the Druzhovka, Kramatorsk and Konstantinovka line. But in some ways, and this is of course, I think, Boris Rozhin's analysis, but I guess you go along with it. I'm in no position to contradict it. In some ways, the greater immediate crisis for the Ukrainians would come from the fall of Soledar, which would open up this critical situation for the Ukrainians. It would lead to the likely collapse of Ukrainian resistance in Siversk, and that in turn would probably lead to the collapse of the whole situation, the whole Ukrainian positions in northern Donbass, along the border between Kharkiv and Donetsk region, this area where the Ukrainians have been talking at various times of launching offensives. So this is quite a comprehensive and detailed analysis that's been provided by Slavyangrad and with an input from Boris Rozhin. Now, I can't verify every part of this. I'm not on the ground, but it seems to me plausible. And as I've said previously, both Slavyangrad and Boris Rozhin have come across to me as consistently reliable reporters, and also, to be frank, especially in Rozhin's case, pretty good analysts of the military side of things as well. Anyway, that's what the Russians are saying about the whole situation. What are others saying? Well, the Western reports, as I said at the start of this program, are now starting to recognize that Ukraine is facing an operational crisis in the Soledar area. So there's a report here from a German journalist, Julian Röpke. Now, can I just say, he, by contrast to Slavyangrad and Boris Rozhin, he's clearly strongly sympathetic to the Ukrainians. You could have to, again, allow for his biases, but he does, on balance, or at least come across to me as one of the more level-headed commentators from the Western side about the war. And this is what he says. Situation in Soledar is terrible. The Russians captured more than half of the town and are encircling what is left at the same time. Notice what he says about encircling what is left at the same time. Ukraine needs a massive counter-offensive here, or it's lost, which would likely result in a domino effect and more areas lost soon. So, Julian Röpke, on the one hand, appears to confirm these reports that we're getting from Slavyangrad about the actual state of the battle for Soledar, and he seems to confirm also, or at least he comes to the same conclusions, if you like, as Boris Rozhin, that if Soledar falls, then that will have major repercussions for the Ukrainians altogether. So, an interesting comment from Julian Röpke, and he seems to say that the only way in this situation could be retrieved would be for the Ukrainians to launch a major counteroffensive to try to relieve the pressure on Soledar. And I'm going to come to that shortly because, as we will see, the Ukrainians have not been idle, and they've been trying to do also, it seems to me, some of the things that Julian Röpke says. But meanwhile, we've had further reports, one from the Institute for the Study of War in the United States, a website of an institute that essentially takes a fervidly pro-Ukrainian side, I would say, and it admits that the Wagner forces, all advances in the Bakhmut area, are invariably now attributed to the Wagner forces, both by Russian and Western commentators, though in my opinion, it's clearly that large numbers of different formations of the Russian forces in Ukraine are involved. But anyway, the Institute for the Study of War says that the Wagner group have reached the Artyom Sol plant in the city center and have been pushed in all other respects to the northwestern part of Soledar. This is from the Institute of the Study of War, and it also admits that the forces of the Wagner group have advanced to Klashayevka, which is south of Bakhmut. So we're starting to see some reports from Western sources that admit that there is an operational crisis for the Ukrainians in the Soledar Bakhmut area. Now, there's an awful lot more. There's an awful lot of chatter. I've just seen another report. This also appears on Slavyangrad, though I don't think it originates with them, but it claims that the defense of the armed forces of Ukraine near Soledar is crumbling like a house of cards, and the system of defensive positions crumbled, and that they were occupied by units of the 28th Mechanized and 17th Tank Brigades. During their flight, 5 more strongholds were abandoned. Lots of talk about massive Ukrainian casualties. I have to say, I have seen some films and photographs which purport to be or claim to be from this area, which also appear to show heavy casualties. I'm going to say that this particular report I'm going to skip. I can't corroborate it, and it seems to me to have less circumstantial detail. It's probably true, but it doesn't, in fact, to my mind, add very much, except it perhaps gives some colour to the sense of what is happening. Anyway, overall, a difficult situation for Ukraine in Soledar Bakhmut. And if I can just mention one last person who's commenting about all of this, Alexei Arestovich, Zelensky's own spin doctor, has now come out and said that the situation in Soledar is difficult. The town is semi-surrounded by the Russians, and he says that the Russians are aiming to cut off Soledar from Bakhmut and cutting the Soledar-Slavyansk road. Well, I don't consider Arestovich to be a particularly reliable source, but anyway, he too seems to be admitting that the situation for the Ukrainians in this part of the battlefield is now becoming very critical. Now, all of these reports that I said spoke about the situation in the early hours of this morning. I don't know what's happened since. I would point out that since midnight, Moscow time, I presume, Putin's Christmas truce has come to an end. Not that it seems to have ever been especially effective. It's also the case that temperatures across Ukraine are now falling, and that the ground apparently is now hardening, and that we're now in a situation of deep, permanent frost, which ought to make the movement of heavy material, tanks and that sort of thing, easier, which, given the fact that the Russians have a heavy preponderance of armor in eastern Ukraine, I would have thought would work increasingly to their advantage. But anyway, there we are. That's the situation on the battlefronts. It looks as if Soledar gradually being encircled, perhaps not so gradually, perhaps quite rapidly. Ukrainian forces have been pushed out of Bakhmutsky. They've been pushed out of the central and eastern areas of Soledar. They're clinging on in a place called the Artyom Sol plant in the center, but obviously are under pressure there. And they're also being pushed to the western suburbs, the western part of Soledar, and elsewhere in Bakhmut, they're coming under lots of pressure in multiple places. Now, going back to Julian Rödtke, he was talking about a massive Ukrainian counteroffensive. And in fact, over the last couple of days, as this operational crisis in Soledar, Bakhmut, has intensified, one gets reports, lots of reports about attempts by Ukraine to actually launch counterattacks, or at least to try to reinforce and plug the holes that are starting to appear on the Ukrainian lines. Now, one of the most interesting pieces of information that I've seen about the fighting in Soledar, which has come through over the last couple of hours, is that the principal Ukrainian military unit that was defending Soledar, brigade, strength force, had apparently participated in the Kherson offensive. After the completion of that offensive, it was then relocated by the Ukrainian military command to Zaporozhye, where it was presumably intended to play a role in the planned Ukrainian offensive towards Melitopol. But then, as the situation in Bakhmut has deteriorated over the last few weeks, it's had to be redeployed again from Zaporozhye to the Bakhmut area, to be precise, to Soledar. And from what I can tell, most of the reinforcements that Ukraine is rushing to try and hold the line in the Bakhmut-Soledar area are indeed now coming from troops who had previously been set aside, or looked like they'd been set aside, for the Zaporozhye offensive. So, defending Bakhmut is clearly obliging the Ukrainians to rethink their plans. It reminds me a little of what happened, by the way, during the Severodonetsk-Lysychansk battles in the summer. The Ukrainians at that point were already considering, in fact, they were talking incessantly about a planned offensive in Kherson. That offensive in Kherson region was supposed to be launched in mid-August, when Russian forces, by the way, in Kherson region, west of the Dnieper River, were very few in number. But the offensive, as far as I can tell, the Kherson offensive, had to be postponed by several weeks, several critical weeks, because of the operational crisis that Ukraine faced in the Severodonetsk-Lysychansk area, and Ukraine's need, after the fall of those two towns, to plug the defenses by reinforcing its positions in Siversk, which looked for a time as if it was about to fall immediately after the fall of Lysychansk. And that caused the postponement of the launch of the Kherson offensive from 10th August to the very end of August and beginning of September, by which point Russian forces in Kherson region west of the Dnieper had been significantly reinforced, and a fact which probably affected considerably the pattern of the fighting over the course of the Kherson offensive when it was eventually launched. And one sees something like that also, it seems to me, happening again, that Ukraine had ambitious plans for an offensive in the Zaporozhye region, but it looks as if, for the moment, that offensive isn't going to take place, because Ukraine is now faced with this crisis in and around Bakhmut and Soledar, which has serious implications for the entire Ukrainian position in Donbass, as I've just discussed. Anyway, Apparently, Ukrainian losses have been extremely high. There was talk at one point that 2 battalions of the brigade that was defending Soledar were effectively destroyed. I can't confirm these reports, but certainly the Ukrainian ambassador to Britain has apparently, in a radio interview, which I admit I have not heard, but he's reported to have admitted very heavy losses indeed on the part of Ukraine. So, an operational crisis for Ukraine in the Bakhmut area, and serious doubts, increasingly serious doubts, about whether Ukraine is able to retrieve it over the next few days. If they don't, then it looks like the Russians will gain control of Soledar very soon, leading to a severe impact on Ukrainian defenses further north in Seversk, and the essential collapse, or so it seems to me, of the Zelensky line from Bakhmut to Seversk. And of course, if Bakhmut itself falls, well, the Ukrainians do have another line of defense, Konstantinovka, Kramatorsk, Slavyansk, but it looks much more fragile than the current line, which passes through Bakhmut. And of course, it would be the very last line of defense that Ukraine has in Donbass. So, serious situation for Ukraine. If they're able to plug the gap, they might be able to hold the positions for a little longer, but it's clear that they're suffering very heavy losses doing so. And my own sense is that plugging the gaps is only going to postpone the inevitable. I've been saying this for weeks now, and I do wonder what is gained by doing all of this. Why Ukraine continues to throw all these men and machines away to try to hold places like Bakhmut, which sooner or later are certain to fall. I've discussed all of this in previous videos. I'm not going to discuss it further in this video today. But that does bring me back to the topic of my program yesterday and the day before about these new Western arms deliveries. The Bradley infantry fighting vehicle, which is being supplied by the United States, the Marder infantry fighting vehicle, which is being supplied by Germany, the debate that's been raging about the supply of Leopard 2 tanks and other tanks to Ukraine, and all of that. Well, the first thing to say is that Brian Beletic at the New Atlas has done another one of his masterly programs discussing the latest American arms package. And he's pointed out that the 50 Bradley infantry fighting vehicles that the United States is providing to Ukraine are barely enough to equip one US strength brigade. And what Brian Beletic thinks, and I'm absolutely sure that he's right, is that in practice the Ukrainians will divide up these 50 Bradley infantry fighting vehicles and parcel them out amongst many of their units, and they'll be there in penny packets, which will make them even less effective on the battlefield than they might otherwise be. And the same, by the way, applies to the Marder infantry fighting vehicles, the 40 of those that the Germans are providing. And Brian Beletic then discusses how the armor of the Bradley infantry fighting vehicle is thin. It's not really, it's certainly not strong, like strong armor such as you would expect in a tank. And of course the same in effect is true of the Marder. Now, and lastly, he talks about the fact that the 18 self-propelled 155mm guns that the United States is providing probably only replace, and probably only partially replace, the large numbers of self-propelled guns that have been supplied by the Western powers to Ukraine, which the Russians have been destroying. It's probably not even a full replacement for those, all of which I have absolutely no doubt is true. Now, there's a few points I do want to add based upon things that I said. Now, in a recent video, I described the Bradley as a heavy infantry fighting vehicle. I believe it weighs around 28 tons, and the Marder is heavier still. I said it was, and I described it as an even heavier vehicle, and indeed it does. It weighs something like 33 to 35 tons, depending on the model. Now, that provoked responses from various people pointing out that this didn't seem to be consistent with other reports about the thinness of the armor of these vehicles. I see absolutely no inconsistency. These are heavy vehicles by comparison with the analogous Soviet infantry fighting vehicles, the BMP-2 and the BMP-3, which are operated by the Russian army and which have previously been operated by the Ukrainian army in large numbers in these battlefields in Ukraine. Now, those armored vehicles, infantry fighting vehicles, weigh, as far as I can see, less than 20 tons each. So they are significantly lighter than these Western infantry fighting vehicles. It does not mean that the Western infantry fighting vehicles have better armored protection necessarily than these Soviet fighting vehicles that the Russians are using. I'm not able to discuss the level of protection provided by infantry fighting vehicles. This is completely outside my area of knowledge, but it seems to me that the Russian vehicles are designed in a different way. They're probably a lot less comfortable than the Western vehicles, and that's probably what explains principally the difference in terms of weight. The point is not whether these vehicles are lighter or heavier than each other. It is, and how much protection that provides. It's the fact that the weight of the Western vehicles is going to result in heavy logistical complications. As I said in one of my recent programs, and I repeat, I have knowledge about this, a vehicle that weighs 40 tons is going to require significantly less maintenance than a vehicle which weighs 60 tons. In fact, a 60-ton vehicle requires twice the amount of maintenance and engineering support that a 40-ton vehicle would do. It increases the logistical and maintenance burden of a vehicle, increases geometrically, not linearly, with the increase in its weight. Now, there are lots of reasons why that is so. Again, I'm not going to discuss them in this program. And what is happening is that the Ukrainians are being obliged to accept Western equipment because there is no ex-Soviet equipment left to supply them with, at least not in anything like enough numbers. They're being obliged to accept maintenance demanding and heavy Western vehicles designed for defensive operations during the Cold War in the heavily developed areas of Central Europe, in Germany and the rest, used by militaries like the American and the German, which have massive logistical tails, logistical support systems, and which have been developed to operate with highly complete air superiority conditions. They've been required to accept these vehicles, these much heavier, maintenance-heavy vehicles with less strategic mobility than the Soviet vehicles that they're used to, because there is now a shortage of those Soviet-era vehicles, despite the fact that it's those Soviet-era vehicles which, or so it seems to me, are much better adapted to the kind of war that Ukraine is fighting. So this is not a replacement for what Ukraine has lost. It doesn't come close, even in terms of numbers, in replacing what Ukraine has lost. It's going to, on the contrary, massively complicate Ukraine's logistical problems to try to operate vehicles like the Marder and the Bradley now that they're going to be supplied. And Brian Beletic has made, of course, the further point that we're getting different vehicles being supplied by different countries. So we have Bradleys from the United States, Marders from Germany, we have the AMX-10 wheeled tanks from France, all different vehicles designed by different countries with different logistical systems. It's going to create a maintenance and logistical nightmare to keep all these different types of vehicles operating effectively together on the battlefield, even though the numbers, as I said, are going to be relatively small. And to compound all of this, to compound the Frankenstein appearance of the Ukrainian army that is starting to emerge, we're hearing of all sorts of very strange ideas. So apparently in the next US arms package, or at least in a forthcoming US arms package, the Ukraine is going to be provided with Sea Sparrow missiles. This is a conversion of the Sparrow air-to-air missile. They were converted in the 1960s, a long time ago, into surface-to-air missiles for US warships. Taiwan adapted them to be used from ground launchers. Apparently some work has been done on this to develop this concept further in Poland. Anyway, Ukraine is going to be supplied by the United States with these Sea Sparrow surface-to-air missiles, which could, by the way, be using relatively old technology if they're still using technology from the 60s, but they're going to be adapted to be used from the Soviet era Buk and Cube launchers, SAM-11 and SAM-6, dating also from the 60s and 70s, which are currently operated by Ukraine. This despite the fact that the Sea Sparrow as a missile has less capability than the missiles that certainly the Buk SAM-11 system Ukraine originally used. Fewer capabilities than those missiles. And there's a number of problems. Firstly, you're mating two weapon systems from two radically different technological cultures. I mean, putting an American missile inside a Soviet-designed launcher designed for launching Soviet-type missiles is going to be immensely challenging, or at least so I would have thought, whatever work has been done on this in Poland. And of course, you're going to have to try and use Russian radars, Soviet-era radars, to operate your American-supplied missiles. Well, no doubt it can be done, but can it be sorted out? Can all the problems be sorted out at speed? And I suspect there's going to be all sorts of problems as well. But the other problem is that these missiles, these Sea Sparrow missiles, are much more short-ranged than the missiles that the Soviet launchers, the Buk and the Kub, were designed for. And it's been pointed out that if these Buk and Kub, SAM-6 and SAM-11, are going to continue to be used with the Sea Sparrow missiles in the role that they were originally designed for, which is to provide air defense for the Ukrainian ground forces, then because these missiles are much more short-ranged, the launchers will have to be deployed closer to the front lines, where they will become more vulnerable to Russian strikes. Alternatively, they could be redeployed to the cities to try to provide defense, some levels of defense at least, against these Russian cruise missile and drone attacks. But of course that means depriving Ukrainian ground forces of an existing or a previously existing air defense capability that had previously been provided by these SAM-6, SAM-11 launchers. But putting all that aside, again, Frankenstein systems being created to try to plug gaps in Ukrainian defenses. And it's now increasingly clear that there are growing doubts in Germany specifically about supplying Leopard 2 tanks to Ukraine. The United States has already apparently categorically ruled out supplying Abrams tanks to Ukraine. And the principal reason here is the one I've discussed up to now, the logistical challenge of keeping these massive 70-ton US Abrams tanks with their enormously complex and sophisticated and difficult gas turbine engines operating in a place like Ukraine. It makes it such a nightmare that the Pentagon has apparently completely ruled it out. The Leopard 2 would face some of the same problems, but it's probably a more rugged tank. It could probably operate in Ukraine. But already there is a pushback about this. It seems that in Germany, the decision to supply the Marder tanks has not gone down well. According to an opinion poll, 49% of Germans, Marder infantry fighting vehicles, has not gone down well. Apparently, according to an opinion poll, 49% of Germans oppose it, as against 40% who support it. And according to the same opinion poll, a strong majority of Germans oppose supplying Leopard 2 tanks to Ukraine. There's clearly a steady shift in Germany away from the very hawkish pro-war positions that prevailed in Germany a few months ago. German public opinion is becoming increasingly skeptical. And skepticism is now starting to be voiced increasingly from within Chancellor Scholz's own Social Democratic Party, the party that supposedly leads the German coalition. Apparently, some members of the party are not happy with the Marder delivery, and a senior member of the party, I believe its president, has come out and has spoken out against deliveries of Leopard 2 tanks by Germany. The only circumstance in which that could be done is if other states, other Western states, were prepared to supply their own tanks. And bear in mind that with the United States categorically ruling out delivery to Ukraine of its Abrams tanks, it becomes much less likely that the other major NATO powers, Germany, France, and Britain, would be prepared to supply tanks of their own. So these weapons deliveries starting to look more doubtful. Come back to the point I have made many times. Ukraine is slowly running out of time. But not so slowly, actually. The Bakhmut crisis is one that has been developing ever since the summer. The offensives in Kharkiv and Kherson have added to it. Lieutenant Colonel Vyshinin put it best. Ukraine achieved some tactical successes at the expense of its long-term strategic capabilities. And we see that with a reduction in weapon systems, the resort to these Frankenstein Western weapons, which are probably only going to make the situation in the long term on the battlefield for Ukraine worse, and which are starting to strain Western support for Ukraine. And last but not least, we're also seeing it in the huge losses of manpower that Ukraine is suffering, and which have led directly to this operational crisis in the Bakhmut Soledar area. Well, I've discussed many times the unwisdom of the strategy that the Western powers and Ukraine have embarked upon in trying to conduct this war in this kind of way. But we get still an extraordinary unwillingness to face the implications of this. And there was an extraordinary article for me by Daniel Hannan, a British journalist, in which he discusses the state of the war. And of course, he repeats, I should say that he's very much a journalist who I would imply is to some extent aligned at least with neocon thinking. But anyway, he discusses the state of the war, and he appears, despite uttering many cliches about Ukraine's success, he appears to recognize how precarious the whole Western position is becoming in Ukraine. And I saw this paragraph. He says, Bob Seeley, the Isle of Wight MP who lived in Kiev for years and whose recent PhD was on Russian military strategy, argues that every outcome except an outright Ukrainian victory is in effect a Russian victory. If the front line frees and Russia absorbs its new regions administratively, Putin wins. If the West tires and refuses to send Ukraine the armor, artillery, and weapons it needs, Putin wins. If China picks this moment to attack Taiwan, Putin wins. And you can go on that way. I don't know how realistic some of these options are. You could go further and talk about, for example, the Ukrainian collapse, and we're starting to see that in Bakhmut, and then that would obviously also be a case of Putin wins. But anyway, he talks about every single option being a Russian victory except for an outright Russian defeat. And he says the least bad option is thus to press on until Putin, in other words Russia, is defeated. But then, and this is really most extraordinary, he then talks about the fact that a Russian defeat, a crisis for the Russians like that, might lead the Russians to resort to nuclear weapons. Now, I'm not saying that this is a realistic scenario. A Russian military defeat, in my opinion, in Ukraine is not remotely a realistic scenario, but it is the one that Hannan is considering. He says every option has to be ruled out, every other option other than a Russian defeat is a Russian victory. So we must aim for a Russian defeat. And then he talks about what the Russians, what Putin might do. He admits straightforwardly that in the event of a Russian defeat, the Russians might consider using nuclear weapons. At least that's what he says. He says you can't rule the possibility of the Russians using nuclear weapons out. I don't believe that possibility exists, but that's what Daniel Hannan appears to think. And yet, it's a possibility he's prepared to risk in order to achieve a total Ukrainian victory, because everything else, every other end result of the war would be a Russian victory. Now, this is, in my opinion, utterly disastrous thinking. You risk it's not, to be very clear, when you read it like this, it's not the Russians who are the people who are really prepared to contemplate nuclear war. Why should they? By Hannan's own assessment, on most counts, most outcomes, almost every outcome one could think of, except the least likely, a Ukrainian victory, the Russians are going to win. People who are prepared to risk nuclear war, according to Daniel Hannan's own article, is ultimately the West. Now, I have to say, I am incredulous when I read this kind of article and this kind of analysis. Surely the priority should be to avoid that eventuality at almost all costs. I'm not talking about total Western capitulation, but rather a hard-headed look at what the outcomes in Ukraine can be and what Western interests actually are. Would the absorption of the four regions into Russia really be such an existential crisis for the West that it's worthwhile risking nuclear war to prevent it? I mean, I'm just giving one example. Is it not much better to come to a compromise now, even if that means accepting something that we would acknowledge to be a Russian win, rather than face the disaster that a nuclear war might be? And of course, what about the real disaster, the one that really threatens? Because I still think that nuclear war is most unlikely. The one that Daniel Hannan won't contemplate because, of course, he can't. And that is not of the Russians achieving what they might call a win, and not of Ukraine achieving a total Russian defeat. What about the possibility of the Russians achieving a total victory and Ukraine facing a total defeat? Would that not be an even worse outcome? It seems to me that the logic of all of this is completely clear. We can put aside perhaps what the Ukrainians are going to do. I mean, a lot of people have said to me, and I think this is correct, that there is no conceivable way in which Ukraine is ever going to sit down and negotiate, that this is now hopeless to expect that possibility. But if Ukraine cannot negotiate, that doesn't mean that the Western powers are prevented from negotiating as well. Western governments need to consider what their interests and the interests of their nations are. And if bringing this terrible war to an end is the best outcome for the West, or the least bad outcome for the West, then that is what Western governments, both for humane reasons and also for reasons of elementary self-interest, that is what Western governments ought to be doing. Anyway, we see that instead of doing that, and in the face of the gathering catastrophe that of the kind that we see on the Bakhmut front, what we see instead is sending Frankenstein weapons, old Marder infantry fighting vehicles, Bradley infantry fighting vehicles designed for a completely different type of war, Sea Sparrow missiles, clumsily integrated with Buk Soviet-era launchers and electronic and radar systems, all that sort of thing, in order to achieve, well, what precisely? To make the executives of the military-industrial complex in the West rich? To save the face of the neocons, or to pursue their strategy? Well, what exactly? Because I have no idea any longer what the real plan in this war of the Western leaders actually is. Well, thank you for joining me for this, again, long program today. I hope it's been useful. I hope you've taken something useful from it. Obviously, we're in a dynamic and evolving situation in Soledar, Bakhmut, and we will see what happens over the next few days. I'll keep you updated about that. And there's been a rather interesting article in Bloomberg about the Russian economy and the Russian war economy, which I'm going to turn to in my next program as well. Well, thank you for joining me again today. More from me soon. As I said, in the meantime, remember, you can find all our videos on our various platforms: Locals, Rumble, BitChute, Odyssey, Rockfin, and Telegram. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. You can go to our shop, buy yourself the amazing things that you will find there: our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, all those great things. And last but not least, if you've liked this long video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. Thank you again. More from me soon, and have a very good day.